Clara walked down the crowded city sidewalk with a calm smile on her face. It had been a long day at work, but the evening breeze felt soft against her skin, and she was glad to be out in the open air. She carried a small bag on her shoulder, and her steps were steady, unhurried. To the people passing by, she was just another young woman going about her evening. Nobody could have guessed the responsibility she carried in her daily life. She wasn't only someone finishing her office hours, she was an FBI agent, trained and trusted to handle serious matters. But right now, she looked like any ordinary person in the city. That was exactly how she liked it, blending in, unnoticed. The city street was alive with sound. Car horns honked in the distance, shopkeepers called out their last deals of the day, and families hurried home with grocery bags. Clara loved this mix of everyday life because it reminded her of why she worked so hard to protect the normalcy that many people took for granted. She had seen difficult cases in her career, but she never let those experiences harden her heart. For her, every evening walk was a way to breathe and reconnect with the world she served. Just as she turned the corner near a bookstore, a voice behind her called sharply. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Clara turned, surprised, and saw a uniformed police officer approaching her. His steps were firm, and his expression was serious. People nearby glanced at the scene but quickly returned to their own business, not thinking much of it. Clara, however, felt a shift in the air. She was used to authority, but this man's tone carried something extra, an edge that didn't feel right. "Yes, officer," she asked politely, her voice calm. The officer narrowed his eyes at her. "Where are you coming from?" His tone wasn't friendly. It sounded more like an interrogation than a casual question. Clara adjusted the strap of her bag and answered simply, "From work. I'm just heading home." He gave her a quick look from head to toe, then stepped closer. "We've had reports about someone causing trouble around here. You match the description." Clara's brows furrowed slightly, though she kept her voice even. "I believe there must be a mistake. I've done nothing wrong. Maybe I don't match your description as closely as you think." But the officer didn't seem convinced. His posture was stiff, and his eyes held suspicion. Clara had dealt with suspicious looks before, especially when she was undercover, but this was different. She wasn't undercover now. She was just herself, off-duty, and there was no reason for this treatment. Passers-by started to notice that the officer's tone was louder than necessary. A few slowed their steps, curious to see what was happening. Clara could feel the attention building, and she didn't like it. She valued her privacy, but she also knew the situation could turn into something bigger. Her training told her to stay composed, to let the scene play out until she had to step in with authority. The officer asked for her ID, but before she could reach into her bag, he stepped even closer, his voice rising. "Why are you hesitating? Do you have something to hide?" Clara took a slow breath. She wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not in public. Still, she reminded herself that patience was her strength. Losing her temper would only make things worse. "I'm not hiding anything," she replied firmly. "I'm reaching for my identification." But the officer didn't wait. His impatience grew, and he moved as if he were about to search her right there on the sidewalk. Clara felt a wave of frustration inside, but on the surface, her face stayed calm. People around them had now fully stopped to watch. A mother with her child, a group of students, and even an older man with groceries stood nearby, their eyes locked on the scene. The air was filled with tension, as if everyone could sense that something unusual was unfolding. Clara kept her gaze steady on the officer. In her mind, she went through her options. She could stop this immediately by showing her badge, but she also knew that revealing her identity wasn't something she did lightly. Being an FBI agent wasn't about pride or proving power, it was about responsibility. She needed the right moment. For now, she wanted to see how far the officer would go before he realized his mistake. The sidewalk, which moments ago had been filled with the normal rhythm of city life, was now a stage of silence, with Clara and the officer at the center. The cars still moved, the shops still glowed with lights, but everyone nearby was focused on them. Clara could almost hear the whisper of thoughts in the crowd, wondering what she had done, why the officer was being so stern, and what would happen next. The officer repeated his question, louder this time, "Where exactly were you before you got here?" Clara answered in the same measured tone, "At my workplace. I walked straight here." He didn't believe her. His doubts seemed to grow, even without reason. Clara realized then that this wasn't about her matching any real description, it was about the officer's own judgment, and perhaps his assumptions. That realization stung a little, because she knew how damaging such assumptions could be. She had seen cases where people suffered simply because someone in authority made the wrong call. And now, she was standing in the middle of that very experience. Despite the unfairness, Clara refused to let anger dictate her response. She had been trained for tense encounters, for situations far more dangerous than this. She reminded herself of that training now, letting it guide her. Her calmness was not weakness, it was strength. She stood upright, her shoulders squared, her eyes steady. The crowd shifted slightly, sensing the growing weight of the moment. Clara could feel the pulse of the city around her, but her focus was sharp. She knew this was only the beginning of something that would soon take a dramatic turn. The crowd around Clara and the officer grew thicker as minutes passed. What started as a simple stop on the sidewalk had turned into a scene that no one could ignore. The officer's voice was sharp, and his actions carried a weight of authority that made bystanders hesitant to intervene. Still, people were curious. Some whispered quietly, others pulled out their phones to record, sensing that this was not just an ordinary exchange between a police officer and a passerby. Clara stood tall, even though her heart beat faster than usual. She had been in risky situations before, but those were during missions, with preparation and purpose. Here, she was simply walking home, and yet she found herself in the middle of something she hadn't expected. She kept reminding herself not to lose patience. Every second mattered, and every action was being observed not only by the officer but also by strangers around her. The officer, meanwhile, seemed to grow more impatient. He paced slightly in front of her, his expression tightening. His eyes darted at her bag and then at her calm face, as though he couldn't accept that someone standing so composed might be innocent. Clara noticed his unease. It wasn't the kind of professionalism she respected in law enforcement, it was more like frustration, a rush to prove control. "Do you think this is a game?" he asked loudly, drawing more attention. "When I ask questions, I expect answers without delay." Clara's voice was firm but respectful. "I answered your questions, officer. I told you where I was and where I'm going. I'm not hiding anything." But instead of being satisfied, the officer took a sudden step forward. His hand reached toward her shoulder, and in that careless motion, he caught the edge of her shirt. With an unexpected pull, the fabric tore slightly, making Clara stumble backward in surprise. A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. The sound was sharp, as if the entire sidewalk had taken a breath at once. Clara steadied herself quickly, her mind racing. She wasn't upset for herself, she had faced far worse during field operations. But here, in front of ordinary people, this act was more than just an invasion of her personal space. It was humiliating, unnecessary, and completely out of line. She glanced around at the faces staring at her. Some looked sympathetic, others shocked, and a few simply held their phones higher, determined to capture everything. Inside, Clara felt a spark of frustration, but she pushed it down. Her years of training had taught her how to control emotions, how to act with discipline even when treated unfairly. She knew this moment was critical. If she responded in anger, the story would twist against her. Instead, she remained composed, though her eyes grew sharper. The officer didn't seem to notice the crowd's reaction. Perhaps he thought his uniform alone justified his behavior. Perhaps he believed his authority couldn't be questioned. But Clara knew better. Authority was not about loud voices or forceful actions, it was about responsibility, respect, and integrity. Watching him now, she saw none of those values. For the people watching, the situation had become uncomfortable. A mother shielded her young daughter's eyes, whispering for her to stay close. A group of students whispered among themselves, clearly upset by what they were witnessing. And the older man holding grocery bags shook his head slowly, muttering under his breath that this wasn't right. Clara could feel the weight of their silent support. It strengthened her resolve, reminding her that she wasn't standing alone. But she also knew they couldn't step in directly. They were just witnesses, unsure of how far the officer would go. The torn fabric on her shirt didn't matter to Clara personally, but the meaning behind it did. It was a sign of disrespect, a crossing of professional boundaries, and a reminder of how quickly power could be misused when not guided by principle. She straightened her posture, looking directly at the officer, her silence louder than any words she could have spoken in that instant. The officer, perhaps realizing he had gone too far, shifted uneasily. But instead of apologizing, he continued to act with authority. "If you have nothing to hide, then why are you so calm?" he demanded, as though calmness itself was suspicious. Clara took a steady breath. Her voice, when she spoke, carried clarity that cut through the heavy air. "Because I have nothing to fear. I told you, I was walking home. That's all." The crowd nodded subtly, agreeing with her composure. But the officer seemed unwilling to let go of his doubts. He stepped closer again, his eyes narrowing as though trying to intimidate her further. He didn't know that each step he took only made his position weaker, because every person standing nearby was witnessing the truth unfold in front of their eyes. For Clara, the humiliation was not in the torn fabric but in the misuse of authority she was forced to endure. She thought about all the times she had worked alongside dedicated police officers, men and women who carried their duties with honor. This man was not reflecting that same honor. Instead, he was turning his badge into a tool of pressure, not protection. Minutes passed, though they felt much longer. The tension in the air was thick, but Clara remained unmoved, her composure unbroken. She knew she could end this any time by showing her true identity, but timing was everything. Revealing her badge too early might make it seem like she was using her role as a shield. She wanted the truth of the officer's behavior to be seen clearly by everyone first. Only then would her reveal carry its full weight. The officer, still unaware of the storm he was walking into, adjusted his stance as though preparing to continue his questioning. Clara looked at him, her gaze unwavering. Her thoughts were calm but sharp. "You think you're in control now, but the truth is about to change everything." The torn shirt, the shocked gasps, the silent support of the crowd, these were all building toward a moment of transformation. Clara knew the turning point was near. She could almost feel it in the way the officer's voice grew louder, the way the people leaned closer, the way the city itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. And in that pause, Clara stood strong. She was not just an ordinary woman on a sidewalk. She was more than what the officer saw. She carried a truth that would soon bring balance to this unfair situation. For now, she endured the humiliation, not because she was powerless, but because she understood the power of timing. The evening sun dipped lower, casting long shadows on the pavement. The stage was set, the audience was watching, and the story was far from over. Clara's patience, her dignity, and her quiet strength were preparing the ground for what was about to unfold. The sidewalk was tense, and the crowd's silence grew heavier with every passing second. People whispered to each other, some shaking their heads, others pointing their phones toward Clara and the officer. What had started as a simple stop was no longer just a question and answer situation. It had become a public scene, one where every move was being judged, every word was being recorded, and every action was shaping the way people saw both Clara and the officer. Clara knew this was the moment where things had to change. She had allowed the officer enough time to show his behavior, and the crowd had seen how far he had gone. If she kept waiting, the situation might spiral further. Her training told her to control the moment, to take back the ground that had been shaken under her feet. And now, it was time to reveal who she truly was. She slowly reached for her bag. The officer's eyes followed her movement sharply, suspicion filling his face. "What are you reaching for?" he barked, his voice firm and impatient. Clara didn't flinch. Her voice was steady. "You'll see," she said softly, though her tone carried the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. The officer stiffened, preparing as though she might be pulling something dangerous. The crowd leaned in, curious, their eyes fixed on her hand as it went inside her bag. A few people even whispered, wondering if she was about to prove herself innocent or if the officer's suspicions were right. The air felt heavy with expectation. Then, Clara pulled out a small black leather holder. With calm hands, she flipped it open and raised it high enough for everyone to see. The shiny badge inside reflected the streetlights and caught the attention of every single person watching. It wasn't an ordinary ID. It wasn't a simple card to prove her name. It was her FBI badge. For a second, silence covered the street completely. The officer's eyes widened, his confidence breaking apart in an instant. His face turned pale as the truth sank in. The woman he had doubted, humiliated, and mishandled was not just an ordinary civilian. She was a federal agent, someone with authority higher than his own, someone trained to recognize right from wrong, and someone who knew exactly how to hold people accountable. The crowd reacted almost immediately. Gasps filled the air, followed by murmurs. "She's FBI," someone whispered loudly. Another voice added, "Oh no, he messed up big time." Phones that were already recording now zoomed in closer, capturing every detail of the badge, every twitch on the officer's face, every ounce of truth that had just been revealed. Clara lowered her arm slightly but kept the badge in clear view. Her eyes locked with the officer's, steady and unshaken. For the first time that evening, it wasn't him controlling the situation. It was her. "Step back," she said firmly, her voice calm but filled with authority. The officer didn't move at first. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. His confidence, which had seemed so strong moments earlier, now melted into shock. He finally took a small step backward, his posture losing its rigid edge. Clara didn't need to raise her voice. Her calmness carried more power than shouting ever could. "I gave you every chance," she continued, "to treat me with respect, to follow procedure, and to listen. Instead, you chose to act without care, in front of witnesses. And now, the truth is here." The officer looked around nervously, realizing that dozens of eyes were on him, and dozens of phones were recording his every expression. He understood that this moment would not disappear. It would stay as proof of what had just happened. The crowd's energy shifted. Where there had been discomfort, there was now a sense of justice unfolding. People whispered words of support, some even nodding toward Clara as though silently applauding her strength. She had not only stood her ground but had done so with patience and dignity. For Clara, revealing her badge wasn't about showing off power. It wasn't about embarrassing someone in return. It was about restoring balance, about reminding everyone watching, including the officer, that authority must always be matched with responsibility. A badge was not a free pass to mistreat others, it was a symbol of duty. She wanted that truth to be clear, not just to him but to every witness on that sidewalk. The officer finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't know. You should have said earlier." Clara's eyes didn't soften. I gave you chances to handle this correctly. You chose not to. That's on you, not me. The honesty in her words hit harder than any argument could. The officer lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. His earlier authority was gone, replaced by shame and realization. Clara stood still, her badge still visible, her presence commanding the space. She didn't need to say much more. The silence around her was filled with the unspoken truth: the officer had made a mistake, and she had handled it with grace. The bystanders began to murmur more loudly now, their words carrying clear judgment. She's right. He crossed the line. This is going viral for sure. Their voices formed a chorus of support that wrapped around Clara, making her feel the strength of truth standing on her side. At that moment, Clara wasn't just representing herself. She was representing everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had been misunderstood, everyone who had stayed quiet when they wanted to speak. Her reveal wasn't just a personal defense, it was a lesson being taught in real time. The evening sun had almost disappeared, leaving behind glowing streetlights and the soft hum of the city. Yet, on that sidewalk, it felt as though the brightest light was the badge in Clara's hand, shining with the weight of truth. The officer took another step back, his posture now completely defensive. He opened his mouth again but stopped, realizing that no explanation could erase what had already happened. His silence spoke louder than any excuse. Clara finally closed her badge holder and slipped it back into her bag. But even without it visible, everyone around her knew the truth now. She didn't need to prove herself further. She had done what was necessary, and the balance had shifted entirely. The moment had transformed. Where there had been humiliation, there was now respect. Where there had been doubt, there was now certainty. Clara had revealed her true self at the right time, and it changed everything. As she stood there, calm and unbroken, the sidewalk no longer felt heavy. Instead, it felt lighter, filled with the energy of justice being seen and understood. Clara knew the story was far from over. There would be consequences, there would be follow-ups, and the officer would have to answer for his actions. But for now, she had done what she needed to do. She had shown her badge. She had revealed the truth. And she had turned the tide. The atmosphere on the sidewalk had completely shifted after Clara showed her badge. A few moments earlier, the officer had been the one holding power, speaking loudly, and commanding attention. Now, the tables had turned. Clara stood firm, calm, and composed, while the officer appeared uncertain, almost cornered by his own mistakes. The people watching no longer saw Clara as just a woman being questioned. They saw her as someone who carried true authority and had handled the situation with remarkable patience. The officer stepped back, but his face was flushed with embarrassment. He tried to regain some control by clearing his throat, yet his voice lacked the firmness it had carried before. "Ma'am, he began, but his words fell apart. The crowd's presence made it impossible for him to cover his actions with excuses. Clara didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. Her steady voice carried weight. "I gave you clear answers. I followed your instructions. But instead of listening, you chose to overstep." Her words echoed with truth, and the people around her nodded subtly in agreement. The officer's earlier actions replayed in everyone's minds, and there was no way to deny what had happened. Phones continued recording, some even broadcasting the scene live on social media. The officer realized he wasn't just facing Clara, he was facing dozens of witnesses and, soon, possibly thousands of viewers. Clara's years of training helped her maintain her calm. She wasn't interested in shaming the man in front of her. She was interested in accountability, in making sure what had just happened would not be repeated with someone else who might not have the strength or the tools to defend themselves. With a calm but firm tone, she said, "Call for your supervisor." The officer blinked in surprise, his lips parting slightly. He had expected anger, shouting, or even threats. But Clara's professionalism cut deeper than any of that. It was a direct order, one he had no choice but to follow. For a brief moment, he hesitated, but the weight of the stairs around him pushed him to act. He reached for his radio, his hand slightly unsteady, and called in for backup. His words were short, his voice low, as though he wished no one could hear. But the crowd heard, and they knew something bigger was unfolding. As the minutes passed, the energy around the scene grew more intense. People whispered about what would happen next. Some speculated about the officer's career, while others praised Clara's calmness. A group of young students even whispered to one another about how inspiring it was to see someone stand their ground so gracefully. Clara remained silent for a while, her posture strong, her eyes watchful. She wasn't there to argue or explain herself anymore. She had already revealed the truth, and now she was allowing the system to respond. Soon, 2 more police cars arrived at the scene. Their flashing lights painted the sidewalk in red and blue, catching the attention of even more passers-by. Out stepped a senior officer, older, with a steady presence that immediately shifted the mood. He scanned the crowd before walking toward Clara and the officer. "What's happening here?" the senior officer asked, his tone calm but authoritative. Before Clara could answer, the younger officer began speaking quickly, his words rushed, almost defensive. But Clara didn't interrupt. She waited, allowing him to speak, because she knew that the truth was not in words but in actions, and the senior officer would soon learn everything he needed to know. When the younger officer finished, Clara took a small step forward. Her movement was calm but commanding. She reached into her bag again, pulled out her badge, and presented it directly to the senior officer. "Special Agent Clara Adams, FBI," she said clearly. The senior officer's eyes widened slightly, his expression tightening with seriousness. He took the badge, examined it carefully, and then looked back at Clara with respect. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, impressed by how smoothly she handled herself. Clara continued, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "I was stopped without cause. I was questioned without respect. And I was treated in a way no civilian should be treated. The entire incident has been witnessed by dozens of people and recorded by multiple cameras." The senior officer listened intently, nodding slowly. He then turned his gaze to the younger officer, who now looked pale and uncomfortable under the weight of both authority and truth. The difference between Clara's composure and the younger officer's nervousness was clear to everyone watching. The senior officer finally spoke, his tone serious. "We'll handle this from here. Agent Adams, I apologize for what you experienced. This will be addressed properly." Clara gave a small nod, her calmness never breaking. She wasn't looking for apologies, she was looking for accountability. But the acknowledgement from the senior officer was enough for now. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence gone completely. He avoided eye contact with Clara, aware that his actions had not only embarrassed himself but had also tarnished the image of his department. The senior officer instructed the younger one to step aside, and the crowd watched as he reluctantly obeyed. For many of the witnesses, it was a powerful moment seeing how quickly truth and discipline could turn the situation around. Meanwhile, Clara remained the center of quiet respect. She hadn't needed to shout, argue, or use force. She had simply allowed the truth to speak for itself, and when the time was right, she revealed who she was. That calm strength was what left the biggest impression on the crowd. The people around began to slowly disperse, though many continued recording or talking about what they had just witnessed. They knew this incident would not be forgotten. It would spread, and the lesson would reach far beyond that sidewalk. Clara, however, wasn't focused on the cameras or the gossip. She was focused on making sure the situation was documented properly. She gave her statement clearly, outlining every step of what had happened. She spoke not with anger but with precision, making sure there was no room for misunderstanding. By the time she finished, the senior officer assured her again that the matter would be investigated thoroughly. Clara thanked him politely, though her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too many cases where words didn't match actions. Still, she knew that this time, the evidence was undeniable. The crowd, the recordings, the badge, everything was in her favor. As she finally stepped away from the scene, Clara felt a mix of emotions. There was relief that it was over, pride that she had handled it with dignity, and determination that justice would follow. She walked with steady steps, the torn edge of her shirt a reminder of the humiliation she had endured, but her calm posture showing that she was never truly shaken. Behind her, the flashing lights continued, and the younger officer stood in silence, realizing his career might never be the same again. The lesson had been hard, but it was clear. Authority was not about power over others, it was about responsibility toward them. For the crowd, for the officer, and even for Clara herself, this moment became a turning point. It wasn't just about one sidewalk, one evening, or one mistake. It was about something bigger, the importance of respect, the strength of truth, and the courage to stand tall even when treated unfairly. And Clara, as always, had chosen to let her calmness do the talking. The days that followed the incident on the sidewalk were filled with conversations, headlines, and questions. What had happened was not just a small event that people could forget easily. It had been recorded by witnesses, shared on social media, and discussed by strangers who had never even met Clara. The video spread quickly, with people commenting on both the officer's actions and Clara's calm response. Clara herself remained composed. She did not seek fame, nor did she enjoy being in the spotlight. She valued her privacy, but she also understood the importance of truth. Once the story reached the public, she knew it was no longer just her experience. It was now a moment that carried meaning for many people. Within her own department, Clara was praised for the way she handled herself. Her colleagues, who knew her well, were not surprised. They had seen her face challenges before with the same quiet strength. But even they admitted that the way she managed a personal injustice in front of strangers showed a side of leadership that inspired them deeply. Meanwhile, the officer who had mistreated her faced consequences. His department opened a formal investigation. The senior officer who arrived on the scene that day submitted a detailed report, supported by multiple witness statements and countless video clips from bystanders. There was no way to deny what had happened. The officer was suspended while the case was reviewed. For him, the silence of his own colleagues spoke volumes. He had once believed his badge gave him unquestionable power, but now he realized it was responsibility that mattered most. The look on his face as he left the department building on that first day of suspension showed regret, though regret alone could not erase his actions. Clara did not follow the updates with excitement or bitterness. She trusted the system to do what was right. Her focus was on continuing her work, carrying out her duties with the same dedication as always. But deep down, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Not because the officer was being punished, but because the incident had sparked conversations that truly mattered. On talk shows, news programs, and even online forums, people discussed what they had seen. Some spoke about the importance of accountability. Others highlighted the bravery it took for Clara to remain calm instead of reacting emotionally. Many said the story reminded them that not everyone who appears powerless truly is, and not everyone who wears a uniform always lives up to the values it represents. One evening, Clara sat at her desk, reading a letter she had received. It was from a young woman who had seen the video online. The letter spoke about how she often felt powerless in the face of unfair treatment, but watching Clara handle herself gave her courage to believe in her own strength. Clara smiled softly as she folded the letter back. For her, that single message was worth more than all the attention the news had given. She thought back to the night of the incident. She remembered the torn shirt, the sharp tone of the officer, the silence of the crowd, and the moment when everything shifted because of her badge. But most of all, she remembered her choice to remain calm. That choice had not only protected her dignity but had also turned the entire situation into a lesson for others. The following week, Clara was invited to speak at a community event about law enforcement and public trust. At first, she considered declining. She was not someone who enjoyed public speaking or being at the center of attention. But after thinking about the letter she had received, she realized her experience could help others. And so, she agreed. On the evening of the event, the room was filled with people, students, parents, professionals, and even a few officers. Clara stood at the podium, her voice clear but gentle. She didn't speak with anger or bitterness. Instead, she spoke about respect, patience, and the importance of balance between authority and responsibility. Authority, she said, looking around the room, is not a weapon. It is a promise. A promise to protect, to listen, and to serve. When that promise is broken, trust is broken too. But when authority is used with respect, it builds bridges instead of walls. The audience listened in silence, her words settling deeply. Many nodded, while others simply sat in thoughtful quiet. Clara knew she had touched their hearts. She ended her speech with a reminder that dignity was not just something to protect for oneself, it was something to respect in everyone. After the event, several people approached her to thank her. One of them was a young police officer who admitted he was new to the job. His eyes were filled with sincerity as he told her, "Your story reminded me why I chose this career. I want to make sure I never forget what this badge really means." Clara shook his hand, her heart warming at his words. She knew change would not come overnight, but moments like this gave her hope. As weeks turned into months, the incident gradually faded from the headlines, replaced by new stories and fresh events. But for those who had witnessed it, whether in person or online, it remained unforgettable. The image of a calm woman holding up her badge against unfair treatment stayed in their minds as a symbol of quiet strength and justice. For Clara, life returned to its usual rhythm. She continued her assignments, investigated cases, and supported her team. Yet, she carried the memory of that evening with her, not as a burden, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful statement is made not with loud words, but with calm truth. The city sidewalk where it had all happened looked ordinary again. People walked past it every day, buying books from the nearby store, carrying groceries, or hurrying home after work. To them, it was just another part of the city. But for Clara, every time she passed that spot, she remembered the lesson that had unfolded there. And though she never sought recognition, she knew that for many people, her story had left a lasting mark. It had shown that strength does not always come from force. Sometimes, it comes from patience. Sometimes, it comes from dignity. And sometimes, it comes from the quiet confidence of knowing who you are, even when the world doubts you. In the end, Clara's journey through that evening was not about winning against one officer. It was about standing tall for the truth, about reminding others of the value of respect, and about showing that justice is not just found in courts or reports, it is also found in the way people choose to act in the face of unfairness. Her story became a quiet but powerful reminder that real authority shines brightest when it is guided by humility, respect, and responsibility. And for Clara, that was the lesson worth carrying forward for herself, for those who witnessed it, and for everyone who would one day hear her name.